The forgotten photograph. The sunlight slanted through the thick glass walls of the Meta headquarters in Menlo Park, illuminating the polished surfaces and silent buzz of innovation. Mark Zuckerberg, now well into his 40s, moved through the halls. With a quiet intensity, he wasn't the fresh-faced Harvard dropout anymore. His demeanor had shifted into something more thoughtful over the years. Meta had evolved. The metaverse, once a dream, had grown into a sprawling, immersive reality that redefined human connection. But beneath the success, something old stirred in Mark's heart that morning, something distant. He couldn't quite place it. His assistant, Lila, handed him the morning briefing. Mark thanked her with a nod, but paused as a photo slipped out from between the reports. An old photograph, creased at the edges, with a faint handwritten note on the back. He turned it over and saw the scribble. "To my little genius, with love. Nana Elsie, 1994. The photo showed a young Mark, perhaps 9 or 10, grinning wide with a bowl of cereal in one hand and a tech magazine in the other. Beside him sat a woman in her 50s, wearing a modest pink apron and smiling warmly. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder, a small but significant anchor of comfort. Mark blinked. The world seemed to slow around him. That photograph hadn't surfaced in decades. "Nana Elsie," he murmured, his voice almost breaking. Lila tilted her head. "Is everything all right, Mr. Zuckerberg?" Mark hesitated, eyes locked on the image. "Where did this come from?" "I'm not sure. It was tucked in with the daily papers. Maybe—" Mark raised a hand. "Can you do something for me, quietly?" "Of course. I need to know if Elsie Morrow, is still alive. She was my nanny when I was a kid. I haven't seen her since I went off to college." Lila nodded, instantly aware of the emotional charge in her usually composed boss. Right away. As she walked off, Mark sat down, the photo in hand. Memory flooded back. Winter mornings wrapped in thick blankets, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg, bedtime stories about stars and constellations. The time he cried when his first computer broke and Elsie knelt beside him and fixed it with nothing but calm reassurance and a butter knife. She had always believed in him, even before he did. He never told her what she meant to him. 3 days later, a discovery. Lila returned to his office with a strange look on her face, something between disbelief and sadness. "She's alive," she said. "Elsie Morrow lives." "In Yonkers, New York," Mark stood up. "That's amazing. She's what, 85 now?" "She is, but—" Lila hesitated. "She's still working," Mark blinked. "Working? At 85? At a small daycare center, minimum wage. Apparently, she never fully retired. She says it keeps her going." Mark frowned. The thought of the woman who once nurtured his dreams, still laboring in old age, didn't sit right. "Get me a bicycle. Jet to New York, quietly. Just me and security. I want to see her, personally." Lila nodded and left without question. Yonkers, New York. The reunion. It was a grey, breezy afternoon when Mark arrived at a modest daycare tucked into a residential neighborhood. The building was small but well kept, its windows adorned with colorful drawings and happy stick-figure children. He entered quietly, accompanied only by one discreet guard who stayed at the door. Inside, the sound of laughter filled the room. And there she was, Elsie. Her hair was a halo of snowy curls, and her back hunched slightly, but her presence still filled the room. She moved slowly, helping a little girl with her shoelaces, humming a tune as she worked. There was a kindness in her movements, a rhythm of gentleness that hadn't changed. Mark felt his throat tighten. She looked up as he stepped forward, confused at first. Then her eyes widened. "Mark," he smiled, eyes watering. "Hi, Nana." Tears welled in her eyes, and before he could say more, she reached out and embraced him, fragile arms around his neck, strength still in her grip. "My God, look at you," she whispered. "It's really you." Coffee and memories. They sat on a bench outside the daycare as the children napped inside. Elsie sipped from a styrofoam cup, hands trembling slightly. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said. "You just grew up and vanished into that big world of yours." Mark looked down. "I'm sorry, Elsie. I should have come back. You meant so much to me." "You were a brilliant boy," she said with a soft smile. "Always had your head in the stars and your hands in wires." "I owe you more than I can say," she waved a hand. "Oh, hush. You don't owe me anything. I had a job and I did it. Besides, you were the joy of my life back then." He looked at her. "Why are you still working?" Elsie laughed. "What else would I do? Sit at home and knit scarves? These little ones keep me going. Besides, social. Security isn't what it used to be, but I get by." Mark felt a swell of anger, not at her, but at the system, at the world, at himself. You should be resting, traveling, living your life, not changing diapers at 85. She patted his. "And I'm fine, dear, really." But he knew she wasn't. The unbelievable gesture Mark returned to Menlo Park the next day with a fire in his chest. He called a press meeting, not for Meta, but for something else entirely. "I want to share a story," he began to a roomful of confused reporters. "Not about the metaverse or AI, but about a woman named Elsie Morrow." He recounted everything, her kindness, her role in his life, how she still worked quietly in Yonkers without complaint. He choked up halfway through. "I never got to thank her, but I will now." Then came the announcement. "I'm launching the Elsie Foundation, a $100 million initiative focused on elder care, affordable housing for retired caregivers, and creating pensions for private workers like nannies and caretakers, people who shape lives but are too often forgotten." The world was stunned, but, more importantly, Elsie was stunned. He returned to Yonkers a week later, with news cameras now hovering nearby. She met him with open arms. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Mark smiled. "Because you never stopped believing in me. It's time I believe in others the way you believed in me." The Nanny's Gift. Part 2. The Ripples of Kindness. The days following Mark Zuckerberg's announcement of the Elsie Foundation sent quiet waves through both mainstream media and grassroots communities. But no one felt the weight of those ripples more than Elsie Morrow. While the headlines celebrated the billionaire's heartwarming gesture toward his former nanny, Elsie was adjusting to a reality that, until a few days earlier, would have been dismissed as an old woman's daydream. She hadn't asked for a single cent, nor had she expected that her decades-old kindness would ever return to her in such dramatic fashion. For most of her life, she had simply given love because it felt right, never once calculating it like a ledger or seeking reward. Yet here she was, watching camera crews park outside her modest apartment complex and local officials suddenly requesting meetings and interviews, all because she had once tucked in a boy and made him feel safe in a world he hadn't yet begun to understand. Mark, for his part, had returned to Menlo Park, but his mind was still tethered to Yonkers. He found himself pausing during meetings, his thoughts drifting to Elsie's trembling hands and worn shoes. She was one of millions like her, he realized. Caretakers, domestic workers, retired nurses, and elderly companions who had quietly propped up society without a stage, applause, or a golden parachute. In the weeks that followed his announcement, Mark met with his closest advisors and legal teams to finalize the logistics of the Elsie Foundation. Unlike his past philanthropic endeavors, which focused heavily on technology, education, and global internet access, this initiative was rooted in something more deeply human: gratitude. The foundation's goals were ambitious, but not unreachable. It would launch community hubs in underserved cities like Yonkers, Detroit, Camden, and Tulsa, offering affordable housing and financial stipends for retired caregivers. A companion program called Legacy Stories would collect and publish the oral histories of elderly workers, ensuring their voices were not only heard, but preserved. For Mark, this wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about giving people like Elsie something they had given all their lives: dignity. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after their reunion, Mark returned to Yonkers. But this time, he came not with fanfare, but in quiet resolve. He knocked on Elsie's door with a bouquet of yellow tulips, her favorite. She opened the door with a surprised but soft smile, still dressed in her light blue cardigan, the same one she wore at the daycare. "You again," she teased, stepping aside to let him in. "I missed your tea." Mark grinned. She chuckled, her voice still musical. "You flew across the country for tea?" Mark paused. "No, I flew here because I realized something. This isn't about charity, Elsie. It's about accountability. People like you raised people like me. We build our futures on your shoulders, and it's time we act like it." Elsie poured them both a cup of tea and sat across from him. Her apartment was modest, cozy, filled with family photos, hand-knitted blankets, and books lined with worn spines. There was peace here, but also fatigue etched into the corners. "I'm proud of you," she said, placing a hand gently on his. "Not because you're famous or rich or any of that. I'm proud because you remembered. That's all we ever hope for, that we're not forgotten." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "You're not anymore." That afternoon, Mark took her on a walk through the very park he used to play in as a child. They sat on the same old bench beneath the maple tree, where Elsie once read stories to him. And there, with the breeze rustling the leaves, Mark told her about his plans. Not just about the foundation, but a scholarship in her name at Queen's College, an annual caregivers award called the Elsie Honor, and a digital documentary about her life called Roots of Grace, which would be released for free across Meta's platforms. "I don't want to be famous," she whispered, her eyes tearing up. "You're not becoming famous," Mark said, gently. "You're becoming remembered. There's a difference." As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a warm glow over the park, children played nearby, their laughter echoing across the benches. Elsie watched them, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. She had raised so many children, loved so many, and said goodbye to most. Now, for the first time, someone had returned, not just with flowers, but with purpose. That night, back in her apartment, she opened a package Mark had left her. Inside was a leather-bound journal with gold lettering. "To Elsie, for the lives you've built." Beneath it a note: "This is just the beginning. Write what you remember. The world is listening now." And for the first time in decades, Elsie Morrow picked up a pen, not to sign a daycare attendance sheet or fill out a social security form, but to tell her story, the awakening of a movement. Within 2 months, the first branch of the Elsie Foundation opened in Yonkers. The small building, formerly an abandoned library, had been transformed into a vibrant center for retired caregivers. There were therapy rooms, wellness classes, art studios, and legal advisors on call. Most importantly, there was a shared space where elderly people could simply sit and talk, where their stories were heard, their jokes laughed at, and their pain met with compassion rather than silence. Mark personally attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but chose not to speak on stage. Instead, he sat in the crowd beside Elsie, watching as she cut the ribbon herself. She had become, in an unexpected way, a symbol, not of suffering, but of strength that refused to collapse even under the weight of age, isolation, or neglect. Media outlets covered the story with enthusiasm. But what surprised Mark most was the volume of letters and messages pouring in from people around the world. Grown adults who shared stories of their nannies, caretakers, and elderly neighbors who had made an impact on them. Some included photos. Others sent poems. One message from a teacher in Mumbai read, "We often forget the people who shaped us. You reminded us to remember. Thank you for making kindness louder than ambition." But for every message of gratitude, there were others that underscored the urgency of the mission. Elderly women who had been evicted, caregivers suffering in silence, retired nannies living in shelters because their work had never been recognized. As formal labor, Mark read them all, his heart heavier with each story. The need was greater than he had imagined, so he expanded the initiative. 10 new centers were approved across the country within 6 months, each named after a caregiver whose story had been submitted and verified by the foundation. The program began employing retired caretakers in advisory roles, offering them a sense of usefulness beyond their pension years. And through the Meta platform, a new digital space called LegacyNet was launched, an interactive memorial where users could upload and celebrate the stories of the people who had raised them. Back in Yonkers, Elsie became a quiet local celebrity. Children she had once cared for visited her, some now parents themselves. She continued working at the daycare part-time, not because she needed the money, but because, as she always said, little feet still make the biggest sounds in my heart. A different kind of legacy. One evening, as autumn painted the sidewalks in gold and rust, Elsie sat with Mark in the same park once again. The benches had been replaced with new ones, each engraved with names of caregivers honored through the foundation. They watched a group of teenagers help a few elderly volunteers plant flowers along the path. "You changed the world again," Elsie said softly. Mark shook his head. "You did. I just passed it on." Elsie leaned back, the last of the sunlight, warming her face. "Then let's promise each other something." "What's that?" "No matter how far we go, or how high we climb, we keep looking back. Because someone's always there holding the ladder." Mark nodded, deeply moved. "I promise." In the months that followed the launch of the Elsie Foundation, its influence began to unfurl beyond the initial framework of social support for retired caregivers. What started as a heartfelt gesture had begun transforming into a quiet revolution, a shift not just in policy or philanthropy, but in human perception. Conversations about aging, care work, and intergenerational gratitude were taking place. Across living rooms, classrooms, town halls, and boardrooms, the media's initial fascination with the billionaire and his nanny had faded. But what endured was more meaningful. Communities began looking inward at the people they had once overlooked. Elderly neighbors, caretakers, former babysitters, even crossing guards were being thanked publicly, recognized, and in some small way honored for their often invisible work. Mark Zuckerberg had tapped into something universal: the human yearning to matter, especially in the twilight of life. Yet for Mark himself, the journey had only deepened. He found that every time he returned to Yonkers, it stripped away layers of detachment that years of wealth, power, and executive distance had built around him. At Meta headquarters, he was still seen as a disruptor, a visionary, someone consumed with the future. But in Elsie's presence and in the modest corridors of the Foundation's community centers, he was reminded that the present held its own kind of urgency. No technological frontier, no virtual platform could replace the warmth of a handwritten note, the crinkle of an elder's laughter, or the intimate texture of stories that came not from data but from lived experience. His conversations with Elsie became deeper, less focused on structure and more on philosophy, on the responsibility of remembering, of staying human in a world obsessed with acceleration. One particularly brisk Saturday morning, Mark arrived, in Yonkers unannounced, wearing a navy sweater, jeans, and a wool cap pulled low. He didn't bring security, nor did he alert the Foundation staff. Instead, he walked straight into the community center just as breakfast was being served. Dozens of elderly men and women sat at round tables, sipping hot coffee and chatting. about news, grandchildren, and aches that came with the seasons. A few younger volunteers, part of the Bridges Youth Mentorship Program, mingled between tables. It was a program that had been suggested by Elsie herself, pairing teenagers with retired caregivers to foster empathy and conversation across generations. At first, it had seemed experimental, but now it was thriving. Mark scanned the room and spotted Elsie near the window, her white hair glowing in the morning light, her hand resting gently on the wrist of a young girl as they laughed together. She looked radiant, older, yes, but more alive than anyone in the room. As he approached, the girl turned and did a double take. "You're Mark Zuckerberg," she said, wide-eyed. "And you must be smarter than me," he replied with a warm smile, "because you've got Elsie all to yourself." Elsie looked up and smiled, recognizing his voice instantly. "Back again so soon. You know, the frequent flyer miles on your conscience must be racking up." Mark sat beside her. "I needed a reset." The girl introduced herself as Kiara, a high school sophomore from the Bronx who had joined the Bridges program a few months earlier. "I didn't think I'd get much out of it," she admitted. "But then I met Miss Elsie, and now I'm writing my college essay about her." Mark raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed. "Really? She taught me more in a week than I've learned in years about life, love, and what it means to serve." Without expecting anything back, Elsie gently squeezed Kiara's hand. "She's got a poet's heart, this one. Her story isn't easy, but she shows up. That's what matters." It was in this moment that something clicked for Mark. Not a flash of innovation or a business model, but a revelation of connection. Here, across a flimsy folding table, sat three people from radically different worlds: tech titan, retired nanny, and an inner-city teen, bound by nothing but honesty, humility, and shared presence. This, Mark thought, was the real architecture of the human spirit. Not code, not networks, not platforms, but bridges, built not by algorithms, but by listening. Inspired by that encounter, Mark spent the next several weeks working closely with educators, psychologists, and urban community leaders to expand the Bridges program. He envisioned it as something scalable and enduring, yet grounded in intimacy. Each participant, youth or elder, would be paired based on shared experiences or complementary differences. The aim wasn't mentorship in the traditional sense, where one imparts and the other receives, but mutual reflection. Elders would not only teach, but also listen. Youth would not only learn, but also question. It would be, as Elsie later called it, a dance of dignity. Funding poured in from unexpected sources. Tech executives, inspired by Mark's openness, offered donations. Foundations that once dismissed elder care as a soft issue began to understand its societal weight. Cities across the country requested Bridges training kits, eager to launch. Pilot versions in libraries, churches, and recreation centers. Even international NGOs reached out, seeing potential for cross-cultural application. But while the Bridges program blossomed, not everything came without tension. In several cities, younger volunteers expressed discomfort or confusion about working with the elderly, citing generational divides, communication gaps, or ideological clashes. There were difficult conversations about outdated language, differing worldviews, and painful memories. In some cases, young people discovered that their elders had once harbored prejudices. In others, elderly participants confessed they felt forgotten, even resented by a faster, louder generation. Mark and Elsie did not shy away from these truths. Instead, they held a public roundtable discussion, broadcast online through Meta's social channels, titled "Breaking the Silence Between Us." It featured 5 pairs from the Bridges program, each with a different story to tell: a formerly incarcerated grandmother and a college-bound activist, a retired Vietnam veteran and a refugee student from Syria, a gay teenager and a conservative Sunday school teacher. They spoke, cried, disagreed, and ultimately hugged. The episode went viral not for its polish, but for its rawness. That night, after the cameras stopped and the room cleared, Mark and Elsie sat quietly backstage. She looked tired, but deeply content. "You're changing lives," she said. "So are you." She chuckled. "I'm just an old woman who didn't stop showing up." "That's exactly who the world needs," he replied. As winter approached, Mark visited the Yonkers Center more frequently. Sometimes he came with his wife and daughters, allowing them to see the world he had come to treasure. His children grew fond of Elsie, calling her Nanny, and listening wide-eyed to her stories of New York in the 1950s, or how she once fixed a broken toaster with nothing but a hairpin and prayer. In Elsie, they found something missing in their digital lives, rooted wisdom. For Mark, it wasn't about creating a new company or launching the next tech marvel. It was about something harder to quantify: legacy, remembrance, human investment. He began to understand that true innovation might not lie in disruption, but in restoration, restoring dignity to those history has rushed past. One evening, while standing outside the Yonkers Center, watching the streetlights flicker on, Mark turned to Elsie and said, "We should build a home. A home? Not just for you, for people like you. A permanent place, not a facility, not an institution. A home with gardens, music, conversation, books, and children, lots of children." Elsie's eyes lit up. "Like the world we always dreamed of." "Exactly," he said, "and we'll call it the Bridge House." The Bridge House. The vision for the Bridge House was born not from a boardroom strategy or a philanthropic agenda, but from a moment of quiet realization, an evening in Yonkers, beneath aging street lamps, where a tech mogul and an old woman sat shoulder to shoulder, dreaming. While most of the world continued to race toward digital frontiers, Mark Zuckerberg had begun looking inward, grounding himself in something more elemental: the human need to be known, to be useful, and to be loved well into one's final chapters. The Bridge House would not be a traditional retirement facility, nor a daycare, nor a hospital. It would be a shared ecosystem, a radical experiment in dignity and coexistence, where elders and young people could live not in separate spheres of irrelevance and inexperience, but in purposeful interdependence. It would be, in every way, a sanctuary of presence. Plans began immediately. Unlike previous foundation initiatives, this project required not just funding, but imagination. Mark enlisted architects known not for skyscrapers or stadiums, but for designing trauma-informed spaces, therapeutic gardens, and intergenerational housing in refugee zones. He wanted every corner of the Bridge House to reflect a story. A curved reading room, designed after Elsie's favorite Brooklyn library from her childhood, a greenhouse built in memory of Mark's own grandmother, who once raised roses in her cramped backyard, shared kitchens modeled on community homes in rural Kenya, where multiple generations cooked side by side. This wouldn't be a place people came to retire. It would be a place they came to live. Elsie, while honored to have the vision inspired by her, was adamant about staying involved. She didn't want a statue. She didn't want a suite named after her. She wanted to roll up her sleeves, and so she did. At 86, she joined design meetings, reviewed policies for resident integration, and interviewed prospective program leads with the same maternal intuition she once used to decide whether a new toy was safe or a bedtime story was too frightening. Her ideas surprised even the professionals, suggesting meditation rooms with windows that faced sunrise, installing record players in every common area to encourage dancing, and designing quiet spaces where elders could simply sit in silence, without being asked, "Is everything okay?" But it wasn't just the elders who needed consideration. The Bridge House would also host students, young adults between the ages of 16 and 25, who were aging out of foster care, facing homelessness, or burdened by generational poverty. These were not youth chosen at random. They were young people on the edge of falling through society's cracks. For them, the Bridge House would offer subsidized housing, access to therapy and vocational training, and most importantly, what many had never known: consistent, compassionate elders who listened without judgment. Construction broke ground in a quiet neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, chosen not for prestige, but for its spirit. Newark had long been a city of contradiction, resilience and ruin, culture and struggle, history and neglect. Mark believed that if the Bridge House could thrive in Newark, it could be replicated anywhere. The local community, at first skeptical, quickly became allies. Church leaders offered volunteers. Retired construction workers joined the project, donating their time and skills. Local artists painted murals on temporary site walls. Depictions of hands clasping across generations, of children curled in the laps of elders, of roots and branches stretching across city skylines. When the foundation released renderings of the Bridge House online, the public reaction was overwhelming. Thousands of comments flooded in, some nostalgic, some tearful, many hopeful. One viral post simply read, "If heaven had a waiting room, I'd want it to look like this." But while the aesthetics inspired awe, it was the ethos that stirred, something deeper. In a time where aging was often portrayed as decline and youth as chaos, the Bridge House suggested a third option: that life could be circular, not linear, and that maybe the best way forward was together. As the building rose, from the ground, Mark and Elsie hosted listening circles with both prospective residents and community members. These weren't publicity stunts, they were acts of discernment. Elders expressed fears of being forgotten, of being patronized, of losing independence. Young people voiced their anxiety about being misunderstood, about having their trauma dismissed, about trusting adults when so many had failed them. Mark listened. Elsie responded with stories. She told them about the boy she once cared for, who didn't speak until he was 4, and went on to become a composer. About the teenage girl she mentored, who had been in 6 homes by the age of 11, but now ran her own bakery. "Every one of you," she'd say, "is a story in the middle of being written. Let's make sure you don't write it alone." Perhaps the most significant moment came one quiet afternoon during an internal planning session. A young woman named Talia, who had recently joined the Foundation's outreach team, spoke up. She had been part of the first cohort of Bridges, youth mentors, having once lived in a transitional shelter after leaving foster care. Now, in her 20s, Talia had earned her degree in social work and was helping design the community integration strategy for the Bridge House. "I used to think I was broken," she said, voice steady. "That being passed around meant something was wrong with me. But then I met Miss Elsie. She looked at me like I was already whole, like all I needed was time and someone who wouldn't give up on me." The room fell into silence. Mark watched as Elsie, who had been scribbling notes on a legal pad, gently set down her pen and looked up at Talia with eyes full of water and wonder. "You were never broken," Elsie said softly. "You were just waiting for a place to land, and that was what the Bridge House ultimately became. Not a program, not a charity, not a headline, but a landing place for the weary, for the wise, for the world-weary and the wondering." It stood as a contradiction to the notion that human value diminishes with age or hardship. Here, in this sunlit sanctuary in Newark, 2 worlds touched hands and began to heal. On opening day, almost a year to the date since Mark had found that old photograph of himself and Elsie tucked inside a briefing folder, hundreds of people gathered on the Bridge House lawn. Elders in wheelchairs, teens in graduation gowns, community members, policymakers, and strangers who had traveled simply to witness the beginning of something different. There was no giant PR display, no celebrity ribbon cutting. Instead, the event began with music, a choir of children singing "Lean on Me" while elders clapped in time. Then came stories. Residents shared what brought them here, youth mentors, shared why they stayed. Finally, Mark stepped to the podium. He didn't speak long, he didn't have to. "This house," he said, "was born from a thank you I almost forgot to say. Today, it stands because that thank you became a promise. That the people who cared for us will not be left behind. That the ones climbing up will always reach back. That love, when shared across generations, isn't diluted, it's multiplied." He stepped down, walking over to Elsie, who stood beside a plaque at the entrance. He didn't present it. He didn't announce it. He simply took her hand and helped her place it on the polished brass plate, which read, "The Bridge House, where wisdom lives and youth listens, in honor of Elsie Morrow, who built futures from the quiet power of care." The crowd erupted into quiet applause, but Elsie's face remained still, not from pride but peace. She didn't need the recognition. She had never needed it. What she saw before her, a building alive with laughter, with questions, with the smell of fresh bread and old books, that was enough. There are moments in life when time slows, not because of technology or spectacle, but because a space becomes so sacred that every breath, every glance, every word spoken seems to echo with purpose. The Bridge House, nestled in the heart of Newark, had become such a place. It was not a marvel of modern architecture in the traditional sense, but it carried the unmistakable imprint of something far more powerful: intention. Every hallway whispered stories, every common room pulsed with memories waiting to be made. There was a quiet rhythm here, elders preparing soup while humming songs from the 1940s, young people reading aloud their resumes while being gently corrected on grammar by silver-haired mentors. It was a mosaic of humanity, not built to be perfect, but to be present. For Mark Zuckerberg, it became a second home, and in many ways, a place of healing. While his life in Silicon Valley remained demanding and often relentless, the hours he spent at the Bridge House, walking among its gardens, sitting in on storytelling circles, sharing unscripted conversations with people society had often ignored, offered a depth he hadn't known he needed. For years, he had operated under the belief that building meant scaling, that innovation required velocity. But here, with elders, who measured life not in followers, but in moments of truth, he learned a different kind of building, one that was rooted in stillness and humility. And yet, even in a space so filled with light, the shadow of time was never far behind. Elsie Morrow, the quiet soul behind the very heartbeat of the Bridge House, had grown noticeably slower. She still participated in daily routines, still showed up to planning sessions and reading hours, but her steps were less firm, her voice softer, her eyes more frequently lost in memory. She never complained, never once uttered a word about pain or fatigue, but Mark noticed, so did the staff, and though everyone respected her dignity too much to pry, they began subtly making accommodations, a chair always waiting in her favorite corner of the garden, a mug of warm peppermint tea placed beside her before she even arrived, transportation arranged discreetly when her walking became more labored. Mark tried not to confront the thought directly. He told himself she was just aging, that this was natural, that she'd always be there in some form, if not by presence, then in spirit. But deep down, the fear began to take root. The woman who had quietly molded his heart, whose kindness had reshaped his definition of success, was nearing the end of her earthly journey. And the weight of that truth was unlike anything he had faced in boardrooms, congressional hearings, or media scrutiny. This was personal, intimate, irreplaceable. One rainy afternoon, Mark arrived at the Bridge House unannounced. He had no meetings scheduled, no press events or speeches prepared. He simply walked in through the side entrance, umbrella dripping, heart heavy. The building smelled of roasted tomatoes and rosemary. One of the elder chefs was making soup, and somewhere in the distance, a radio played a Louis Armstrong record. Mark made his way to the reading lounge, a space with soft chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the garden. Elsie was there, wrapped in a beige shawl, looking out at the rain with a notebook resting on her lap. She didn't turn when he entered, but he knew she had sensed him. "You always come when the skies cry," she said without looking, her voice touched with knowing. Mark smiled, lowering himself gently into the chair beside her. "Maybe I like seeing what blooms." Afterward, she turned to him then, her eyes clear but tired. "You're afraid," he hesitated. "I am." "Of losing me?" He nodded. There was no point pretending otherwise. Elsie reached out and placed her hand over his. Her skin was thinner now, bones more pronounced, but her grip still carried warmth, still anchored him. "You won't," she said. "Not really. I've already given you the best of me. It's in how you speak to the janitor, how you remember the name of the receptionist, how you pause before responding, even when your calendar says you shouldn't. That wasn't always in you. You learned it, and now it's yours to carry." He looked at her, emotions choking his throat. "What if I fail? What if I forget? What if the world pulls me back into ambition and ego and I forget how to just care?" Elsie smiled, and it was the same smile she gave him when he was 8 and had broken his mother's antique vase, sobbing with guilt, until she knelt down and told him, "It's okay. Things break. People don't, if they're loved right. You won't forget," she said, "because love doesn't leave. It echoes, in halls, in habits, in houses like this one." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the soft patter of rain against the windows. Later that evening, Mark convened a small group, senior staff from the foundation, key members of the Bridge House, and even a few of the youth residents. He stood before them, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man moved by the quiet urgency of legacy. With Elsie's blessing, he proposed a long-term vision, not just for one bridge house, but for a network of them, across continents, cultures, economies. But with a caveat. "It can never become a brand," he said firmly. "It must remain a promise." The foundation would move slowly, intentionally. Each new location would be rooted in local culture, shaped by elders from that community, not franchised or duplicated. A global council of elders would be formed, not as figureheads, but as actual decision-makers. Youth leaders from underserved backgrounds would have equal votes. It was a radical model of intergenerational governance, and many warned him it would be hard to manage. He agreed. "That's the point," he said. "Legacy shouldn't be convenient. It should be deliberate." Over the following weeks, Elsie grew weaker. Her time at the center became less frequent, her days quieter. But she remained emotionally present, responding to letters, mentoring young mothers, writing pieces of what she called her final chapter in the journal Mark had given her. She told no one the details of her condition. She didn't want a farewell tour. What she wanted was continuation. One morning, just before sunrise, a caregiver found Elsie peacefully asleep in her room. Her shawl was draped over her shoulders. A closed notebook rested on her lap. She had passed quietly as she had lived, without fanfare, but full of grace. The news of her death spread quickly, and the outpouring of love was profound. From Newark to Nairobi, videos, letters, paintings, poems, and testimonials flooded in. The Bridge House became a sanctuary of mourning and remembrance, but not despair. Instead, there was gratitude. Gratitude that one woman's life, once hidden in the shadows of domestic labor, had become a blueprint for transformation. Mark didn't speak publicly for several days. He grieved in private, walking through the garden alone each morning, sometimes holding the notebook she had left behind. When he did finally address the community, it wasn't with a eulogy, but with a reading, an excerpt from Elsie's final journal entry. Legacy is not built on wealth or titles. It is stitched from small moments, a warm meal, a safe word, a listening ear. It is the imprint we leave on others, invisible but lasting. I am not afraid of dying. I am only afraid that we forget to care for each other. Don't forget, please, don't forget. The room was silent. Then slowly applause rose, not out of celebration, but reverence. Elsie Morrow was gone, but her spirit had been immortalized not in stone or statue, but in lives changed, hearts softened, communities awakened. Mark looked out over the crowd, young and old, rich and struggling, hopeful and bruised, and he knew her legacy was safe. Time has a way of shaping legacy, not in the grand gestures we imagine, but in the quiet, persistent ripples that continue long after the stone has touched the water. In the months following Elsie Morrow's peaceful passing, the Bridge House in Newark evolved from a story of two unlikely friends, a billionaire and a former nanny, into a living movement that defied categorization. It was no longer just a place where youth and elders coexisted. It had become a site of memory, reflection, and renewal, a living archive of what it means to care, to remember, and to grow through connection rather than conquest. And while its founder, Mark Zuckerberg, continued to carry out the duties of his high-profile life, his center of gravity had shifted. His decisions, once driven by market impact or technological scalability, were now rooted in something slower and far more enduring: stewardship. In the weeks after Elsie's funeral, Mark returned frequently to the garden she had helped design, especially during the early hours of the morning. He often came alone, without a phone, walking slowly between the lavender bushes and the wooden benches carved with quotes from elders around the world. There was one bench he visited most, the one beneath the weeping cherry tree, where a brass plaque simply read, "She remembered us first." That was the essence of Elsie's gift, not the money she had never asked for, not the attention she humbly deflected, but the simple, radical act of remembering those society too easily forgot. It was there, under that blooming tree, that Mark began drafting what would become the Light Forward Initiative, a comprehensive global framework for elder-young partnerships modeled after the Bridge House philosophy. But this time, it would go even further. The vision was bold: to integrate a similar intergenerational model within school systems, tech incubators, refugee settlements, and even prisons. Elders would not only be cared for, they would be re-established as mentors, cultural holders, and emotional anchors within institutions that had long dismissed their relevance. Young people would no longer be expected to figure life out in isolation. The bridge would not be a destination, it would become an ethic. Before launching the initiative, however, Mark felt one more step was necessary, one final act to complete: the circle. With the support of his family and a small team of videographers, he began traveling the country, not as the head of Meta, but as a listener. He visited former nannies, retired teachers, caretakers, home health aides, grandmothers, raising grandchildren, and elderly neighbors who had become the only light on a dark block. In these humble living rooms, porches, and community centers, he sat with them, offered tea, and simply asked one question: who did you carry, and who carried you? The answers were rarely what he expected. Some elders spoke of long lost, siblings who gave up school to help raise them. Others told stories of young people, nieces, students, even strangers, who had shown up when their own families had not. These narratives, raw and unedited, formed the core of a docuseries that Meta later released under the title Lifted. It was unlike any content the platform had ever hosted. There were no filters, no viral hooks, just long-form, heart-spoken truth. And to Mark's quiet amazement, it resonated. Millions watched. Not because it entertained, but because it reflected something sacred we so often overlook: our interdependence. Meanwhile, The original bridge house in Newark became a model of community sustainability. The young adults who once entered its doors, unsure of their worth, were now mentoring the next wave of arrivals. Some had started businesses, cafes, gardening collectives, tutoring centers, with elders as their advisors and investors. Others had gone on to college or trade schools, returning during holidays not out of obligation, but out of love. The elderly residents, once hesitant to share rooms and routines with strangers half their age, now referred to them as family. Sunday nights became communal story circles. Tuesday mornings were filled with cross-generational yoga sessions, and on Fridays, the garden became a concert space where laughter and music flowed freely under fairy lights strung from one side of the lawn to the other. And through all of this, Elsie remained, not physically, but wholly in spirit. Her sayings were quoted often, not out of reverence, but familiarity. Staff and residents alike would say, "That's an Elsie thing," when someone offered unexpected kindness or refused to speak over someone else. Her teachings were codified into training manuals, but more importantly, they were passed down in small, ordinary moments. When a teen helped a slow-walking elder across the hall without being asked. When a former foster youth set the table for dinner and made sure the silverware lined up perfectly. When someone new arrived and was greeted not with instructions, but with presence. Mark carried her legacy into every room he entered thereafter. Whether speaking at the United Nations or testifying before policymakers about aging, inequality, or digital ethics, he no longer led with data or metrics. He led with story. He told people about Elsie, not as a narrative device, but as a mirror, because everyone had an Elsie. A grandmother who made too much soup, a neighbor who watched them after school, a janitor who gave them a smile when no one else noticed. And by invoking her, he helped others see that their story, too, was part of something worth preserving. The Light Forward initiative launched globally 1 year to the day after Elsie's passing. Rather than a single event, it was a mosaic of gatherings across continents, small, intimate, grounded in local tradition. In Uganda, elders shared folktales in schools built of red earth and corrugated tin. In Denmark, retired nurses taught mindfulness to anxious university students. In New Mexico, Navajo elders passed down herbal wisdom, while teenagers recorded their voices for future generations. And in each place, a seed was planted, not of dependency, but of reciprocity, not charity, kinship. Back at the Newark Bridge house, on that anniversary day, a ceremony was held. Not to mourn, but to celebrate. A tree was planted in the center of the garden, an olive tree, symbol of peace, endurance, and renewal. Children from the neighborhood sang, and elders read from their journals. Mark was there, sitting in the front row with his daughters on either side. He didn't speak that day. He didn't need to, as the final shovelful of soil covered the roots. Of the olive tree, a teenager named Malik stepped forward. Once homeless, once filled with rage, he had found purpose within the walls of the bridge house, and now stood tall, confident, loved. He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady. "When I came here, I didn't believe in anything. Not family, not the future, but Miss Elsie did. She looked at me like I was already somebody, like I mattered, and now I know. I do. We all do." There was silence. Then soft applause. Then tears. Not of sorrow, but of recognition. In that moment, beneath the wide-open sky, surrounded by generations intertwined, it was clear that Elsie's gift was not just to Mark, not just to one child from a tech-infused world. It was to all of us. A reminder that kindness leaves an imprint no algorithm can track. That legacies are not built in boardrooms or on screens, but in kitchens, in gardens, in whispered bedtime stories, and held hands across hospital beds. Mark watched the tree swaying. gently in the wind, its leaves glistening under the late afternoon sun. He could almost hear her voice, firm, loving, eternal. Don't rush through life, Mark. The people you pass are the ones you'll need to remember. And he did. We all did.